A true story about this grandma. My son and daughter-in-law left me at the airport. No money, no help. Have you ever felt like the world moved on without you, leaving you behind in a moment of loneliness? Today, I want to share the story of a grandmother who was left alone at an airport by the very people she trusted the most. This journey is about more than abandonment. It's about rediscovering strength, dignity, and the power to rise again. A sudden departure. It was a moment that would forever change her life. Standing alone in the heart of Nashville International Airport, an elderly woman gripped her purse tightly against her chest, the fabric of her thin sweater offering little warmth against the cold realization sinking in. There was no return ticket, no suitcase, no familiar faces around her, just an empty itinerary and the overwhelming noise of an airport that seemed to ignore her presence. Only hours earlier, she had woken up full of hope. It was supposed to be a family trip, a break from the silence that had filled her house since the passing of her beloved husband, Jake, just 2 months ago. Her son, Mark, and his wife, Tanya, had insisted she join them. It was a healing getaway, as they had called it. "Get out of the house, Mom," they said. "Stop crying all the time. This trip will do you good." She had been reluctant at first, but they promised her it would be a change of scenery. The thought of a new environment, of sun on her skin, the sound of the ocean, the laughter of her family sounded like the perfect remedy for the grief that had consumed her since her husband's death. She sold the last set of pearls Jake had given her to help cover the cost of the flights, as they had said it would be a group effort. They even smiled and reassured her that everyone would pitch in. It was a family vacation after all. But when she arrived at the airport, things didn't feel quite right. At check-in, Tanya had a priority tag on her bag and her husband, Mark, had a first-class ticket. The woman thought nothing of it at first. After all, she assumed they were just handling things separately for convenience. Tanya had even told her not to worry, they would all check in separately and meet up once on the plane. It wasn't until they scanned her ticket that she felt a strange unease creeping over her. The attendant looked at her with a slight frown, the kind that mixed politeness with an underlying confusion. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's no return flight under your name," the attendant said. "It looks like it's been voided." The elderly woman tried to laugh it off, thinking it was some sort of mistake. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, holding up the printed itinerary she had been given. But as she turned, her heart sank. Mark and Tanya were already heading toward the security checkpoint, oblivious to her growing concern. The woman followed them, still clutching her travel documents, but Tanya turned back, almost as if on cue, and said the words that would haunt her forever. "You know, Mom, we only bought you a one-way ticket. The return trip, you'll figure that out. Maybe call someone to pick you up or sell your phone for bus fare, right?" And just like that, they were gone. Mark didn't even glance back, his sunglasses firmly in place as he walked away. Tanya, with her designer luggage, didn't even break stride. She had said it so matter-of-factly, like it was nothing more than a simple detail, something that could easily be swept under the rug. She wasn't looking back at her mother, not even once. She was already lost in her own world. And just like that, the elderly woman was left standing alone. The world around her didn't stop. She could hear the clicking of rolling suitcases, the distant chatter of travelers, and the announcements for boarding flights. But all of it seemed distant. None of it mattered. What mattered, what cut through all the noise, was the cold emptiness she now felt. She stood in the middle of that airport, a forgotten figure, holding nothing but her purse and the thin sweater clinging to her frail body. She was just another passenger, lost in a sea of people who had no idea of the silent storm raging inside her. It wasn't just the abandonment she felt in that moment, it was the realization that her family, the people she had loved and trusted for so long, had discarded her like a piece of trash. For years, she had done everything for them. She had been there for every birthday, every holiday, every time they needed someone to lean on. And yet, here she was, standing alone, not even a simple apology or explanation to soften the blow. But what hurt the most was not the physical abandonment. It wasn't the lack of a return ticket or the empty suitcase that had been taken from her by her own family. It was the emotional abandonment. The way they had treated her as if she were nothing more than a burden. It was as if they were doing her a favor by including her in this trip when, in fact, they had only done so to relieve themselves of the responsibility. They had used her as a prop and afterthought to make themselves feel better about the whole situation, but she wasn't fooled. She knew exactly what they were doing, and in that moment she made a decision. She would not let them win. They had taken her dignity, but they would not take her strength. The woman stood tall in the middle of the airport, her back straight, chin lifted, even though every fiber of her being wanted to break down and cry. She wanted to scream, to ask anyone to help her, to rescue her from this nightmare. But she didn't. She couldn't. She had no one, and maybe that was the hardest part of all. Her friends had their own families, their own lives. Her sister, who had always been a source of support, had passed away years ago. Who could she call now? For a moment she thought about reaching out to someone, anyone, but then the thought crossed her mind. Who could she call? Who would help her now? The realization hit her like a wave. There was no one left to help her. She was completely alone. And yet, in the midst of that overwhelming loneliness, she began to feel something else, a spark of determination. She may have been abandoned, but she was not lost. The family trip, that wasn't. The elderly woman's thoughts whirled as she stood in the bustling airport terminal. The hurt and confusion that had flooded her heart moments ago slowly began to crystallize into something else. A bitter, aching realization that the healing getaway she had been promised was not, in fact, a trip for healing at all. Instead, it was nothing more than a pretense, a plan that had never included her in the first place. As she stood there, she replayed the events leading up to this moment in her mind. It had all started so innocently. Her son, Mark, had insisted she join them for a much-needed break after the passing of her husband, Jake. The loss had been devastating. 42 years of marriage had suddenly ended with a stroke that took Jake from her in an instant. The days that followed had been a blur of sorrow, with the house feeling too empty, the silence too loud. Her children, busy with their own lives, tried to console her in the only way they knew how. They told her to go out to get some air, to get away from the constant reminders of the life she had lost. Mark and Tanya had been insistent, promising that this trip would help her heal, that the change of scenery would take her mind off the grief. "It'll be good for you, Mom," they had said. "You need to get away for a while." The idea seemed harmless enough at first, a trip to Florida to take her mind off the overwhelming sadness that had taken hold of her since Jake's death. It was what she had needed. She thought, a brief respite, a chance to breathe, to escape the suffocating weight of her grief. But something felt off. As the days passed, she noticed small things that didn't quite sit right. At check-in, Tanya had a priority tag on her luggage, a first-class ticket for herself and Mark. The elderly woman had assumed it was all part of the plan, that they would just sit apart for convenience. But when the woman had handed over her ticket, it had been voided, and that was when the truth began to dawn on her. She had never been a true part of their plans. It had been easy to ignore the small signs in the beginning: her son's distracted attitude, Tanya's polite but distant manner. But now, as she stood alone in the airport, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. This wasn't a family trip at all. This was an escape for them, an escape from her grief, her presence, and ultimately from the responsibility of caring for her. The more she thought about it, the more the truth began to sting. Her son Mark had always been the dutiful one. He had been there during Jake's illness, providing support in his own way. But Tanya, his wife, had always been distant. She had never shown any real warmth toward her mother-in-law. It had always been about appearances, about doing the right thing when others were watching. And now, as she thought back to the little gestures of kindness that had been offered, she realized they had always been more about obligation than love. Tanya's comment about the return ticket echoed in her mind. "You'll figure it out." There had been no kindness in her voice, no sympathy for the elderly woman left stranded at the airport. It was as if her existence was an inconvenience, a burden they were all too happy to discard once they had no further use for her. The finality of it all hit her like a punch to the gut. She was nothing to them now but a problem to be solved. The elderly woman took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. She knew she couldn't let them see her fall apart. They wouldn't care. No, this was her moment to regain control, to remind herself that she was still someone worthy of respect, worthy of dignity. She wasn't some old, frail woman who could be tossed aside at the airport like a piece of luggage. Her mind wandered back to her early years with Mark and Tanya, to a time when they were just a young couple starting out. Mark had always been the kind of son who would call regularly, check in, make sure she was okay. Tanya, on the other hand, had been distant from the start. She had never really shown any interest in building a relationship with her mother-in-law. The woman had tried, of course, inviting her over for dinner, sending little gifts on birthdays. But Tanya had always been polite, never truly warm. The love she had hoped for from her daughter-in-law never materialized. Over time, she learned to accept that this was just the way it was. She would do her part, love her son, be there for her grandchildren, and that was enough, she thought. But now, standing in the terminal with no family around her, she understood that her sacrifices had never been acknowledged. The time she had spent raising Mark, the years she had given to her marriage, the sacrifices she had made for everyone else, none of it had been enough. In the end, it was all about what she could offer, not who she was. Tanya and Mark had seen her as an asset, something to be used when convenient, something to be discarded when they no longer needed her. The pain of that realization cut deep, but it also sparked something within her, a quiet, simmering determination. She wouldn't let them do this to her. She wouldn't be the woman who was left behind, forgotten, and ignored. No, she was more than that. She had to be. She looked around the airport again, her gaze falling on the busy travelers rushing to their gates, oblivious to the quiet devastation unfolding just feet away. For the first time, she felt the weight of her solitude, but she also felt something else, a growing sense of resolve. It was time to take control of her own life again, no more depending on family. No more letting them decide her fate. She thought back to the days when Jake had been alive. The two of them had built a life together, one filled with love, laughter, and hard work. But now, with him gone, she had no choice but to move forward. She couldn't let this betrayal define her. She had been married for 42 years after all. And in that time she had learned that sometimes you have to let go of what you thought was yours to make room for something new, something better. With a final deep breath, she stood up straight, adjusting her purse, and made her way toward the nearest bench. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to cry. Instead, she was going to do what she had always done: find a way to survive. To reclaim her life, a hidden betrayal. The elderly woman sat on the bench, the weight of her situation pressing heavily on her chest. Her mind was still reeling from the shock of what had just happened. Mark and Tanya, the people she had trusted more than anyone else, had betrayed her in the most painful way possible. They hadn't just abandoned her at the airport. They had quietly, methodically removed her from their lives, relegating her to the status of a mere afterthought. As she sat there, feeling the sting of their betrayal, her thoughts turned back to the years she had spent raising Mark. She had done everything for him, sacrificed her time, her energy, her dreams to give him a better life. And now, at the end of it all, it felt like all of that had been for nothing. Mark, her son, her flesh and blood, had left her behind without a second thought, just like his wife had. She wasn't part of their family anymore. To them, she was no longer a mother or a loved one. She was simply a problem to be dealt with, a nuisance to be left behind at the airport. The elderly woman couldn't help but wonder when it had all changed. When had she stopped being important to them? When had she become invisible in their eyes? She had raised Mark with love and care, always putting his needs first. She had been the one to comfort him when he scraped his knee as a child, the one who stayed up late with him when he was sick, the one who made sure he had a good education, and the one who cheered the loudest at his graduation. She had always been there for him, supporting him through thick and thin, but somewhere along the way that love had been forgotten. Looking back, the signs were all there. She had just chosen to ignore them, to believe that things would get better, that family would always come through in the end. She had been so eager to believe the story Mark and Tanya had told her about this trip, the promise of healing, of family bonding, of moving on from the grief of losing Jake. But now, as the reality of what had really happened sank in, she realized that the trip had been nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. It wasn't about her healing. It was about getting rid of her, about making her disappear so that Mark and Tanya could enjoy their lives without the weight of her presence. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. How could they do this to her? How could they treat her like she was nothing? She had given them everything: her love, her time, her support, and this was how they repaid her. By abandoning her at an airport with nothing but the clothes on her back and a thin sweater to protect her from the cold. The woman's anger began to burn, but it was a quiet, controlled anger. This was not the time for a scene. She had learned long ago that anger alone would never get her anywhere. It was time to think clearly, to take control of the situation. She had been wronged, yes, but she was not going to let this betrayal define her. She had lived through difficult times before, and she would live through this one too. As she sat there, the airport around her continued to hum with activity. Travelers hurried past, oblivious to her presence, lost in their own worlds. The elderly woman wondered if any of them would even notice her if she disappeared completely. Would anyone care? Would anyone even stop to help? No, she didn't need anyone. She had made it this far on her own, and she would continue to do so. She wouldn't allow herself to be weak, to be a victim. She was not invisible, she was strong. And though she had been abandoned, she had not been defeated. The elderly woman's mind turned to the small envelope she had hidden in her bra. She had been carrying it with her for years, long before this trip had even been mentioned. It was the business card of a lawyer, an old friend of Jake's. Blake had always said, "If you ever need anything, come find me." And now, in this moment of crisis, she knew exactly who to turn to. Blake had helped them with their mortgage paperwork, their wills, and various legal matters throughout their lives. He was a man of integrity, someone who had always been there for Jake when they needed him. The elderly woman had always trusted Blake, and now she would rely on him to help her get her life back on track. With a sense of purpose, the woman pulled out the business card and looked at the number. For a moment, she hesitated. She had been so used to relying on her family, on Mark and Tanya, for everything. But they had shown her that she could no longer depend on them. It was time to take charge of her own future. The woman's fingers trembled as she dialed the number. The phone rang for a moment before a voice on the other end answered. "Blake Monroe," the voice said, warm and familiar. "It's Blake, right?" The woman asked, her voice shaky but steady. "It's me, it's Linda." Blake paused for a moment, clearly surprised. "Linda, it's been a long time. How are you? Is everything okay?" Linda took a deep breath, steadying herself. "No, Blake, it's not okay. I need to update my will." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Blake's voice softened. "Of course, come down to the office. We'll take care of it." The elderly woman hung up the phone and stood up, her resolve solidifying with each step. She had made the decision to take control of her own life, and that meant standing up to the people who had hurt her. She was done being a victim. She was done being invisible. As she walked through the airport, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be hers. She wasn't just going to let her family write her story for her. She was going to take control of her narrative, and this was just the beginning. A woman's dignity. Linda walked toward the exit of the airport, her movements slow but deliberate. The bustling crowd swirled around her, but in her mind she was focused on one thing: reclaiming her life. The pain of being abandoned by her own son and daughter-in-law still stung, but it no longer defined her. As she stepped outside into the fresh air, the weight of her decision began to settle in, and with it, a growing sense of purpose. She could feel the tightness in her chest beginning to loosen. For the first time in days, she could breathe without the suffocating pressure of grief and loss. She hadn't been in control of her life for so long. After Jake's death, she had let the silence and the sorrow take over, but now she was starting to take the reins again. She wasn't just a widow, she was a woman, and she had the right to decide what her future would look like. As Linda made her way to the taxi stand, she pulled the small envelope from her purse once more. The business card inside felt cool against her fingertips, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to truly take charge of her own life. For too long, she had been living in the shadows of others, always taking a backseat to her family, always putting their needs before hers. But now the time had come for that to change. The taxi ride to Blake's office felt long, the streets of Nashville passing by in a blur. Linda barely noticed the scenery. Her mind was consumed with the conversation she was about to have, the decision she was about to make. She had spent years taking care of others, but now it was time to take care of herself. No longer would she be a pawn in someone else's game. She had the power to change her life, and she was going to use it. When the taxi finally pulled up to the law office, Linda paid the driver, stepped out, and walked through the familiar doors. The receptionist greeted her with a smile, and she was escorted to Blake's office. It was a place she hadn't visited in years, but it felt strangely comforting to be here. The space was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of leather-bound books and polished wood. Blake had always run a tight ship, and it was clear that the office hadn't changed much since the last time she had been there. Blake stood when she entered, a surprised smile crossing his face. "Linda, it's been too long," he said, pulling her into a gentle hug. "I'm sorry to hear about Jake. I know this must be a tough time for you." Linda smiled faintly, but there was no mistaking the determination in her eyes. "Thank you, Blake, but that's not why I'm here today." Blake raised an eyebrow, a hint of curiosity in his expression. "What's going on, Linda? You don't sound like yourself." Linda took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I need to change my will. I want to remove Mark and Tanya from everything, my estate, my savings, everything." Blake's expression softened, but there was no judgment in his eyes. "Are you sure about this?" he asked gently. "I know you've been through a lot, but are you certain this is what you want?" Linda nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, I've thought about it long and hard. They left me behind at the airport today, Blake. They treated me like I was nothing, like I didn't matter. They've been using me for years, and I'm done. I want to make sure that when I'm gone, they don't get a penny of what's mine." Blake didn't say anything for a moment, and Linda could see the wheels turning in his mind. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I understand. You don't owe them anything, Linda. And I can help you make sure your wishes are honored, but I need to ask, why are you so sure about this?" Linda's gaze softened, and she thought for a moment before answering. "Because I've spent too many years putting everyone else first. I've spent decades taking care of Mark, of Jake, of everyone around me, but now I need to take care of myself. I'm not going to let them control me anymore. This is my life, my legacy, and I'm going to make sure it's not defined by their neglect and indifference." Blake nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I understand, Linda, and I'll help you make sure that your wishes are respected. But you know, this decision, removing your son and his wife from your will, this is a big step. It's going to change everything. You're severing ties with them in a way that can't be undone." Linda met Blake's gaze, her eyes clear and unyielding. "I've already been severed from them, Blake. They made that choice when they left me behind. I didn't do this to hurt them. I'm doing this to protect myself, to protect my dignity." Blake smiled then, a soft, approving smile that warmed Linda's heart. "I understand, and I'll make sure that everything is handled properly." Over the next hour, they went through the details of the will, making sure that Linda's wishes were clearly outlined. She made sure that her estate would go to a cause that supported elderly people who had been mistreated or neglected by their families. The organization she chose was called Elder Haven, and it worked to provide housing, legal protection, and community programs for older adults who had been abandoned or financially exploited. As Linda signed the new will, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't just about the money or the assets, it was about reclaiming her power, her voice. She was no longer someone who could be discarded without consequence. She was a woman with agency, with control over her own future. When the paperwork was completed, Blake handed her a copy of the will, and Linda felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It was official now. Her decision was final. Her legacy was hers to define. "Thank you, Blake," Linda said, her voice steady. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Blake smiled warmly. "It's my pleasure, Linda. You've always been strong, but now you're stronger than ever." As Linda walked out of the law office and into the sunlight, she felt a sense of clarity and strength she hadn't known in years. She wasn't just moving on from the betrayal of her family, she was building something new, something for herself. She was no longer invisible, she was no longer defined by the choices of others. She had chosen her path, and it was one she would walk with dignity. The loss of family trust. The weeks following her visit to Blake's office passed in a blur, and Linda slowly began to settle into her new reality. She had severed the ties that had bound her to a family that had betrayed her trust, and now, for the first time in a long while, she felt the full weight of that decision. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about reclaiming her life, her dignity, and her future. She wasn't just a victim of neglect, she was a woman who had made the choice to rise above the betrayal and take control of her own destiny. As the days stretched into weeks, Linda found herself reflecting more on the betrayal that had left her so broken and confused. She had spent her entire life building relationships, nurturing her family, and giving them everything she had. But now she realized she had never been given the same in return. The emotional abandonment she had experienced was deeper than the physical act of being left at the airport. It was the realization that her family had always seen her as a resource to be used, not as a person with her own needs, desires, and value. She remembered the years of selfless giving, the long hours spent caring for Mark as a child, the sacrifices she had made to ensure he had a good education, the countless hours she had devoted to helping him when he started his own family. She had always been there for him, just as she had always been there for Jake. And yet, when it came time for her to need them, to ask for help, they had turned their backs on her. It was as if she had never mattered to them at all. Linda's mind often wandered back to those last few days before Jake passed away. The weeks after his death had been filled with an overwhelming sense of emptiness, a quiet that seemed to fill every corner of the house they had shared for over 40 years. The grief had settled in like a heavy weight on her chest, and in those early days it felt like she might never breathe again. But then Mark and Tanya had come to her with their promise of a family getaway, a chance to escape the sorrow, to heal. She had believed them, she had trusted them, and yet, as she now realized, they had never intended for her to be part of that healing at all. They had used her pain as a cover for their own desires, their own plans, and when the time came to pay the price for their deceit, they left her behind. In the quiet of her apartment, Linda spent her days reflecting on what had happened. She had been betrayed by the very people she had trusted the most. Her son, the man she had raised, had abandoned her. His wife, the woman she had welcomed into their family, had been the one to push her aside with that cold, dismissive attitude. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't a one-time occurrence. The signs had always been there, she had just been too blind to see them. The years of subtle manipulation, of being treated as a burden rather than a mother, had finally culminated in that cruel moment at the airport. But it wasn't just the trip, it was everything that had come before it. The way Mark and Tanya had made decisions without her, the way they had brushed off her concerns, the way they had treated her like an inconvenience rather than a loved one. It all added up. And now Linda was finally ready to face the truth. She wasn't just hurt, she was betrayed in the most profound way. And that betrayal wasn't just about what they had done to her, it was about the way they had taken her trust, her love, and her care for granted. Her grief, once all-consuming, had begun to transform into something else, something stronger, more resolute. Linda wasn't going to sit idly by and let this betrayal define her life. She had spent far too long being a passive observer in her own story. Now she was determined to take control of the narrative. It wasn't an easy process. There were still days when the pain of losing her family was overwhelming. She missed the small things, the sound of Mark's voice on the phone, the way Tanya had always made her laugh with her quirky sense of humor. But as the weeks passed, Linda began to realize something important. She didn't need them to be happy. Her happiness wasn't dependent on their approval or affection. She could build a life for herself, one that was full of peace, joy, and most importantly, dignity. Her decision to remove Mark and Tanya from her wasn't an act of vengeance, it was an act of self-preservation. She had spent so much of her life giving to others, often at the expense of her own needs and desires. Now she was taking back what was hers. She wasn't just letting go of material possessions. She was letting go of the illusion that her family could continue to take from her without ever giving anything in return. Linda began to realize that true family wasn't about blood relations. It wasn't about the people who shared her last name or her family tree. True family was about the people who stood by her, who saw her for who she truly was and respected her for it. She had learned that family could be chosen just as much as it could be given. And now she was choosing herself. It wasn't long before Linda found a new community, a group of people who accepted her, valued her, and treated her with the respect she deserved. She joined a local support group for older adults who had experienced similar betrayals from their own families. The group became a lifeline for her, offering the companionship and understanding she had longed for. In their stories, she found her own, and in their shared experiences, she found the strength to continue rebuilding her life. The woman who had been left behind at the airport was gone. In her place stood a woman who had reclaimed her power. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Linda had learned to trust herself, to let go of the people who had hurt her, and to surround herself with those who truly cared. As the months passed, Linda's life began to take on a new rhythm. She found fulfillment in simple pleasures, long walks in the park, reading books she had always wanted to dive into, and spending time with her newfound friends. She had finally found a place where she felt seen, where her voice mattered, and that was enough. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but it was hers. Linda knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be moments of loneliness, still days when the weight of what had happened would feel heavy on her heart. But she also knew that she was no longer a victim of her circumstances. She had learned to let go of the past, to forgive herself for the mistakes she had made, and to focus on the future. And that was where her true freedom lay, in the power to choose her own path, no matter where it led. Memories of a different time. As Linda sat in her small apartment, the soft afternoon sunlight filtering through the blinds, she couldn't help but reflect on the life she had once known. The days before Jake's death had been filled with routines: morning coffee in the kitchen, evening walks through the neighborhood, and the quiet moments spent sitting on the porch, watching the sunset together. It was a life she had cherished, one that was filled with love, comfort, and the simple joys of companionship. Jake had been her rock, her partner in every sense of the word. They had been married for over 40 years, a bond that had been forged through years of laughter, tears, and shared experiences. They had weathered the storms of life together, from raising their son Mark to the loss of a pregnancy, to the challenges of growing older. Through it all, they had remained side by side, supporting each other in ways that only a lifelong partnership could understand. But now, in the silence of her apartment, Linda was forced to face the reality that Jake was gone. The life they had built together was no more. The home they had shared was now filled with echoes of the past, reminders of a time that seemed to be slipping further and further away. Linda couldn't help but feel the weight of that loss, not just of Jake, but of everything they had built together. The house felt too big now, too empty, and no amount of rearranging the furniture or hanging new pictures could fill the void left behind. The grief had come in waves. Some days were better than others. Some days the memories of their time together felt like a warm embrace, a source of comfort that Linda could hold on to. But other days the memories were sharp and painful, like a wound that never quite healed. The absence of Jake's presence was a constant ache, a reminder of everything she had lost. In the quiet moments, Linda often found herself reminiscing about the little things: the way Jake would hum off-key in the kitchen, the way he would always ask where the cinnamon was whenever he made his morning coffee, the sound of his slippers shuffling across the floor as he moved from room to room. These were the memories that filled her heart with love, but also with sorrow. She could still hear his voice in her mind, could still picture the way he looked at her with that gentle, reassuring smile. But now, as Linda sat alone in the dimming light, she realized that those memories were all she had left of him. And while they brought comfort, they also reminded her of her own solitude. She had spent so many years defining herself through her relationship with Jake, through her role as his wife, as Mark's mother. But now, with both of them gone, she was forced to redefine herself, to find a new sense of purpose, a new identity. The more she thought about it, the more Linda realized that she had been living in the past for far too long. She had allowed her grief to consume her, to define her. She had allowed the memories of her old life to hold her captive, unable to move forward. But now, in this moment of stillness, Linda knew that it was time to let go. It was time to stop holding on to the past and start embracing the future. Her journey toward healing had already begun, though she hadn't fully realized it. The decision to remove Mark and Tanya from her will had been the first step, the first act of reclaiming her autonomy and her dignity. It had been an act of self-preservation, of taking control over her life in a way that she had never done before. But it wasn't just about money or possessions. It was about standing up for herself, about refusing to be a passive participant in her own story. The betrayal she had experienced from her son and daughter-in-law had shaken her to her core, but it had also opened her eyes to the reality that she didn't need them. She didn't need anyone to validate her worth. She had spent too many years trying to please others, trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect family member. But now she knew that her worth came from within. She wasn't defined by her family's actions or their love. She was defined by her own strength, by her ability to rise above the hurt and move forward. As Linda looked out the window, watching the golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the street, she felt a quiet sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from having everything figured out, from having all the answers. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing that she was no longer afraid of the future. She had faced the worst of it, the loss of her husband, the betrayal of her family, and she had survived. Now she was ready to live again. Linda thought about her life ahead. She had no illusions about what it would be like. There would still be hard days, still moments of loneliness and sadness, but there would also be moments of joy, of growth, of discovery. She was not done yet. She still had so much to offer the world. And for the first time in a long while, Linda was beginning to believe that she deserved to experience happiness again. Her journey would take time, but Linda was no longer in a hurry. She had spent too many years rushing through life, trying to meet everyone else's expectations, trying to be the perfect mother, wife, and daughter. But now she had time to focus on herself, time to rediscover the things she loved. Time to find new passions, new friendships, and new ways to experience the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Linda sat back in her chair, a small but genuine smile playing on her lips. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, she was looking forward to it. She had survived the worst, and now she was ready to embrace whatever came next. Her grief was still there, but it was no longer all-consuming. It was a part of her, but it didn't define her. She had learned to let go of the past, to release the pain and the hurt that had held her hostage for so long. And in that letting go, she had found freedom. Freedom to live, to love, and to be herself again. The airport realization. The day Linda realized the full scope of the betrayal was a day she would never forget. That morning, she had left her home with a hopeful heart, believing that she was about to embark on a journey that would provide the escape she so desperately needed. After the loss of Jake, everything had felt muted, like living in a fog. Mark and Tanya's suggestion of a family trip to Florida had seemed like a lifeline. They had promised her that this getaway would help her heal, give her space to breathe, and move forward from the grief that had consumed her for the past few months. The airport had been bustling with energy, passengers rushing through security, families meeting and saying goodbye, flight attendants calling out boarding groups. It was supposed to be the beginning of something new. But as soon as Linda's ticket was scanned, reality came crashing down in a way she had never anticipated. The ticket agent's polite but firm words cut through the noise of the terminal. "I'm sorry, ma'am, it looks like your return flight has been voided." In that instant, the world around Linda seemed to pause. She looked at the agent, then at Mark and Tanya, who were already walking ahead, barely glancing back. Tanya, with her designer luggage, her perfect posture, and her cold, distant smile. Mark, her son, the one who had promised her everything would be okay, walked ahead, adjusting his sunglasses as if he had never known the woman standing behind him. The woman who had given birth to him, raised him, loved him unconditionally for decades. Linda's heart sank as the weight of the situation settled in. She was alone in an airport she didn't recognize, with no return ticket, no suitcase, and no clear way of getting home. She felt like an invisible figure, discarded and forgotten, standing at the edge of the world she had known. For a moment, The bustling airport felt eerily quiet, the voices of travelers, the clinking of luggage, the sound of announcements, all blending into a distant hum. It was as if the world had moved on without her and she was left standing still in a moment of disbelief. Her son and daughter-in-law, the people she had trusted most in the world, had made it clear in that instant that she was not part of their future. They had sold her the illusion of family, the promise of healing, but when the time came to follow through, they had abandoned her. Tanya's words echoed in Linda's mind. "You'll figure it out, Mom. You don't need a return ticket. Just call someone or sell your phone for bus fare. We're done here." It was a sentence said with such nonchalance, as if Linda's years of sacrifice, her unwavering love, had meant nothing. It was as if she had been an obligation, a chore to check off a list, someone to be cared for when it was convenient, but easily discarded when she no longer served a purpose. They had used her grief, her vulnerability, as an excuse to get rid of her. The finality of their actions felt like a slap in the face, and Linda could hardly comprehend the depth of the hurt. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. How could they do this to her? How could they treat her with such disregard? She had raised Mark, had given him everything she could, and this was how they repaid her. With cruelty, with indifference, with the cold, heartless decision to leave her stranded without a second thought. But then, as Linda stood there, tears welling up in her eyes, something shifted inside her. Her anger, once all-consuming, began to burn more quietly. It was no longer about the immediate pain of abandonment, it was about something deeper, something more powerful. This wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a betrayal of her dignity, and she wasn't going to let them strip her of that. She refused to be reduced to a victim in her own story. She had lived through loss before. Jake's death had been devastating, but it had not broken her. She was strong, stronger than she had given herself credit for, and she knew that the only way out of this situation was to take control. She had to stand tall, even if she had to do it alone. With a deep breath, Linda walked over to a nearby bench and sat down, her back straight, her chin lifted. She felt a wave of determination wash over her. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She wasn't going to let this betrayal become the narrative of her life. Her son and daughter-in-law had made their choice, but that didn't mean she had to accept it. She would not beg for their love, their attention, or their approval. She was not their pawn, and she was done playing their game. As she sat there, the realization started to sink in even further. She had no one else to rely on but herself. And in a strange way, that thought brought her a strange comfort. She had spent so many years trying to be everything to everyone, trying to fit into the roles of mother, wife, and daughter-in-law. But now she could let go of all those expectations and focus on herself. She could finally stop living for others and start living for her own happiness. There were still moments when Linda thought about calling someone, her sister, her old friends, but the truth was, who could she really call? Her sister had passed away years ago, and her friends were busy with their own lives. No one would understand the pain she was feeling right now, no one but herself. She was the only one who could get through this, the only one who could take the next step. Linda pulled her phone from her purse and glanced at it, her hand trembling slightly. She had no real reason to call anyone, but she needed to hear her own voice to remind herself that she was still here, still worthy, still capable of finding her way. She unlocked the phone, stared at the screen for a moment, and then went to her contact list. She scrolled down and found the number she had been carrying around in her bra for years, the card from Blake, Jake's lawyer. With a deep breath, Linda pressed dial. Blake answered after a few rings, his voice as familiar and comforting as it had ever been. "Linda, it's been a while. How are you?" "I'm not okay, Blake," Linda replied, her voice calm but resolute. "I need to update my wills." And just like that, Linda took the first step toward taking control of her own future, finding strength in solitude. As Linda sat in the taxi, the city of Nashville slowly fading behind her, she found herself in an unfamiliar state of clarity. The conversation she had just had with Blake, her husband Jake's lawyer, had left her feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: empowered. For years, Linda had been a dutiful wife, a caring mother, a supportive daughter-in-law. She had placed the needs of others ahead of her own. And while she had always considered it an honor to do so, this moment, the moment she had decided to take control of her future, marked a pivotal change in her life. It wasn't just about updating her will, she realized. That was the first step, yes, but it was about reclaiming her autonomy. It was about no longer being defined by the roles that others had assigned to her. No longer was she just the widow or the mother who gave everything but received nothing in return. She was a woman with her own needs, her own voice, her own agency. And that was something she hadn't fully understood until now. The cab turned onto a quiet street, and Linda's thoughts wandered back to the days when she and Jake had built their life together. Their home had been a place of laughter and warmth, filled with shared memories that Linda still cherished. They had raised Mark together, worked hard to provide for him, and shared in the joys of his successes and the disappointments of his failures. But now, as Linda looked back, she could see the cracks in their family, the moments when things had gone unspoken, when love had turned into obligation. The loss of Jake had been an unimaginable blow. They had spent over 40 years together, and she could not fathom her life without him. But in the wake of his passing, Linda had realized something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge before. She had been emotionally neglected for a long time. Jake had been a wonderful husband, but the years of caring for Mark, of putting his needs above her own, had drained Linda in ways she hadn't recognized. When her son and daughter-in-law, Mark and Tanya, had insisted that she join them on the trip to Florida, Linda had felt a flicker of hope. She believed, naively perhaps, that this was their way of helping her heal, of showing her that she wasn't alone. But when she stood at the airport that fateful day, everything became clear. Mark and Tanya had never intended for her to be part of their family's future. The one-way ticket, the voided return, Tanya's cruel words, all pointed to the same conclusion. Linda was no longer needed. Her role had been completed. She had raised Mark, she had taken care of her family, now she was no longer relevant. The weight of that realization had nearly crushed Linda, but it also sparked something within her, a resolve. For so long, she had waited for others to define her worth, but now she understood that only she could decide who she was. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their love. She could find her own way, and she could rebuild her life. When the cab finally stopped in front of Blake's office, Linda stepped out, her resolve solidifying with each step. She had already made the decision to update her will to ensure that Mark and Tanya had no claim to anything she had. But that decision went beyond finances. It was about asserting her right to have a say in her own life. She wasn't a passive player in her story anymore, she was the author. Blake greeted Linda with his usual warmth and professionalism, and they quickly got down to business. The process was simple. Linda wanted to remove Mark and Tanya from her will, ensuring that none of her assets would be passed on to them. But as they went over the details, Linda found herself reflecting on the deeper reason behind her decision. It wasn't about anger or spite. It was about reclaiming her dignity. It was about making sure that, in the end, the legacy she left behind would reflect her choices, not the manipulation and disregard she had experienced. Blake was quick to assist her in making the necessary changes, but as Linda sat there, signing the new paperwork, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. This wasn't a decision she had made in anger. This was the result of careful thought and painful self-awareness. Linda had spent so many years living for others, suppressing her own needs for the sake of those around her. But now, she was finally choosing herself. She was choosing to protect what was hers and to ensure that her legacy wasn't defined by the people who had failed her. As she left Blake's office, Linda felt a sense of weightlessness, like a burden had been lifted off her shoulders. It wasn't about the money or the inheritance, it was about the freedom that came with taking control of her life. She was no longer a victim. She had been abandoned, yes, but that wasn't the end of her story. She would write her own ending. The days that followed were a mix of quiet reflection and newfound strength. Linda began to reframe her perspective on what it meant to be alone. She had spent so many years defining herself through her relationships with others, first with Jake, then with Mark and Tanya. But now, as she sat in her small apartment, surrounded by the quiet hum of her own thoughts, Linda understood that solitude didn't have to be synonymous with loneliness. She could be alone, but she didn't have to be isolated. She could fill her life with meaning and purpose, with friendships and activities that brought her joy. She took up hobbies she had once set aside, like painting and reading. She joined a local community group for seniors where she quickly became close friends with several other women who had also experienced loss and betrayal. In their stories, Linda found echoes of her own. They supported each other, shared their experiences, and offered a comforting reminder that they were not alone. It wasn't family by blood, but it was family in the truest sense of the word. People who saw her, who valued her, who were there for her without conditions. Linda had found a new rhythm to her life, one that wasn't dictated by the needs of others. She began to travel more, taking weekend trips to nearby towns, exploring new places on her own terms. She rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried for years, parts of herself that had been overshadowed by the demands of others. For the first time in decades, Linda felt free. She knew that there would still be hard days, days when the memories of her old life would resurface and weigh her down. But she had learned something important. She was no longer defined by what had been taken from her. She was defined by what she chose to do with the life she had left. As Linda sat by the window one evening, sipping her tea and watching the sunset, she thought about all she had survived. She had lost so much, but she had also gained so much more. She was not the woman who had been abandoned at the airport. She was the woman who had walked away from betrayal and built a new life for herself, one step at a time. And that, Linda knew, was just the beginning, a call to action. It was an early morning when Linda woke up, the first rays of sunlight creeping through the blinds, casting soft shadows on the walls of her apartment. As she sat up, stretching her arms above her head, she felt a strange sense of peace. The stillness in her home felt different now, no longer a void left by grief and loneliness, but a quiet space she had slowly but steadily learned to embrace. The past few months had been a time of profound change for Linda. She had taken control of her own destiny in ways she never thought possible. The decision to sever ties with Mark and Tanya, the act of rewriting her will, had been the catalyst for a much deeper transformation. It was a decision she hadn't made lightly, but one that had ultimately led her to reclaiming her power and her voice. Linda had spent so many years living in the shadows of others, first as Jake's wife, then as Mark's mother, and later as a dutiful daughter-in-law. She had always placed the needs and desires of others before her own, never once questioning whether she was allowed to take up space to express her own desires, to assert her own needs. But now, she had learned that her worth wasn't tied to what others needed from her. It was tied to who she was and what she chose to do with her life. The betrayal she had suffered, though painful, had been the wake-up call Linda needed to recognize her own strength. It had been the catalyst for her transformation. What started as a painful abandonment had turned into the beginning of her personal renaissance. Her journey was far from over, but Linda was finally starting to see that the end of one chapter could be the beginning of something far more fulfilling. As Linda made her way to the kitchen, her mind wandered back to the conversation she had with Blake. Her decision to remove Mark and Tanya from her will hadn't been an act of vengeance or anger. It had been a choice rooted in clarity. It wasn't about punishing them, it was about protecting herself. She had spent too many years allowing others to dictate the course of her life, but now she was in control. But there was more to it than that. Linda knew she had to share her story to make sure that others who felt abandoned, neglected, or betrayed knew they weren't alone. She was no longer the forgotten woman at the airport. She was no longer invisible. She had reclaimed her dignity, and now she wanted others to do the same. Her journey was not just about survival, it was about thriving, and she wanted to help others find that same strength. Linda knew that there were so many others out there, people who had been abandoned or overlooked by their own families. People who had spent their lives caring for others, only to be cast aside when they were no longer deemed useful. She wanted to be a voice for those who had been silenced, to show them that it was never too late to take control, to rewrite their own stories. Her decision to reach out and share her experiences was not about seeking sympathy or validation. It was about offering hope. It was about showing others that they too could reclaim their lives, that they were not defined by the betrayals they had suffered, but by their ability to rise above them. As she sat down at her kitchen table, Linda began to write. The words flowed from her with ease, as if her heart and mind had been waiting for this moment. She wrote about the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the healing that had followed. She wrote about the pain of being abandoned by the people she had loved most and the strength she had found in letting go. But most importantly, she wrote about the power of choice. She wanted others to know that they could choose a different path, that they didn't have to remain in toxic relationships, that they didn't have to endure the neglect or emotional abuse of those who were supposed to love and care for them. It wasn't easy, and it would take time, but she believed with all her heart that anyone could make the decision to stand up for themselves, to walk away from the people who had hurt them, and to build a life that was truly their own. Linda didn't have all the answers, but she had learned that sometimes the first step in healing is simply acknowledging the truth that you are worthy of love, respect, and dignity. The truth that you don't have to settle for anything less than what you deserve. When she finished writing, Linda felt a sense of release. It wasn't just about sharing her story, it was about empowering others to share theirs. She decided to start a blog to reach out to others who were going through similar experiences. She wanted to build a community where people could come together, share their struggles, and support one another in their journeys of self-discovery and healing. The blog wasn't just about stories of betrayal and heartbreak. It was about celebrating resilience, about sharing stories of triumph over adversity. It was about creating a space where people could learn from one another, where they could find the strength to make the difficult choices necessary for their own well-being. As Linda hit the publish button on her first post, she felt a surge of excitement and anxiety. Would people read it? Would they understand? But then she remembered something that Jake had always told her. You can't control how the world sees you, but you can control how you see the world. And right now, she saw the world as a place full of possibility, full of opportunity for change. Linda spent the next few weeks refining her blog, reaching out to others who might benefit from her message. She joined online forums, engaged in social media groups, and shared her story far and wide. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life shared their own stories of abandonment, betrayal, and survival. Many of them felt empowered by Linda's words, finding hope and courage in the idea that it was never too late to change their lives. The more Linda connected with others, the more she realized that her journey had not only been about healing from her own pain, but about helping others heal as well. Through her vulnerability and her willingness to share her experiences, she had created something bigger than herself. She had created a movement of people who were ready to reclaim their lives, to find their voices, and to stand up for themselves. And Linda knew that this was just the beginning. A call to action. Linda sat in her favorite armchair, her laptop open before her, staring at the words she had just written. The light from the afternoon sun poured in through the window, casting a warm glow over her small apartment. Outside, the world was moving at a rapid pace, but inside, Linda had found a quiet space for herself, a space where she could reflect, heal, and rebuild. Her journey had not been easy. The decision to cut ties with her son Mark and daughter-in-law Tanya had been the most difficult decision she had ever made. For months, she had been struggling with the sense of abandonment they had left her with. She had been alone in her grief after Jake's death, only to be further isolated when Mark and Tanya had abandoned her at the airport. The hurt had been unbearable, but now, looking back, she realized that this heartbreak had been the catalyst for her transformation. She had spent so many years defining herself by her roles as a wife, mother, and daughter-in-law. Her entire existence had been wrapped up in serving others, in meeting their needs and expectations. And for so long, she had done so willingly, thinking that was what she was supposed to do. But in the wake of Jake's passing, Linda had been forced to confront the truth. She had been giving so much of herself that there was nothing left for her. She had neglected her own needs, her own happiness, and had allowed herself to be defined by what others wanted from her. But now, as she sat in her apartment, she understood that she no longer needed anyone's permission to live her life. She had reclaimed her voice, her dignity, and her sense of self-worth. And that realization had sparked something inside her, a deep desire to help others who were in similar situations. She wanted to share her story, to reach out to those who had been abandoned, neglected, or taken advantage of by their own families. She wanted to show them that they weren't alone, that they could take control of their lives and build a future where they were valued and respected. Linda had started a blog, pouring her heart and soul into each post. She shared her story, her struggles, and the lessons she had learned along the way. She wrote about the pain of abandonment, but also about the strength that came from standing up for herself. She shared her journey of healing and self-discovery, hoping that her words would resonate with others who were going through similar experiences. The response had been overwhelming. People from all over the world reached out to her, sharing their own stories of betrayal and survival. Linda realized that her voice, her experience, was something that could help others heal too. But Linda wasn't satisfied with just writing. She wanted to do more. She wanted to take her message to the next level, to help people in a more tangible way. She began working with local community centers and senior living facilities, offering workshops on self-empowerment and how to navigate difficult family dynamics. She used her story as a foundation for her lessons, encouraging others to take control of their lives and stand up for their own needs. Her workshops were small at first, just a handful of people attending, but as word spread, more and more individuals began to reach out. They were women and men, some in their 50s, others in their 70s or 80s, who had spent years caring for others and neglecting themselves. Many of them had experienced similar betrayals, either from their children or other family members. Linda listened to their stories, shared in their pain, and helped them find the courage to reclaim their lives. One woman, Anne, had been a devoted caregiver for her husband who had passed away a year earlier. Anne had spent years taking care of him, putting his needs above her own, and when he died, she felt completely lost. Her children had stopped visiting, and she had no idea how to move forward. Through Linda's workshops, Anne began to understand that she had spent so many years defining herself by her caregiving role that she had lost sight of who she truly was. With Linda's guidance, Anne started to find new ways to fill her time, taking up painting, reconnecting with old friends, and traveling to places she had always dreamed of visiting. Another participant, Joe, had spent decades working to provide for his family, only to be cast aside by his adult children once they were financially stable. He had always been the one to give, the one to offer help, but when he needed it most, his children were nowhere to be found. Joe had spent years feeling like a failure, like he had somehow let them down. But through Linda's workshops, Joe began to understand that he wasn't the one at fault. His children's actions were a reflection of their lack of empathy and understanding, not his worth. He began to rebuild his life, finding new hobbies, joining social clubs, and strengthening connections with people who truly valued him for who he was. As Linda listened to these stories, her heart swelled with pride. She knew that the journey was not easy for any of them, but she also knew that by sharing her experience, by showing others that they were not alone, she was making a difference. Each person who came to her for help, each person who left her workshops with a renewed sense of self-worth, was a reminder of the power of reclaiming one's life. Linda knew that the road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges. There would still be days when the memories of her past would resurface and threaten to pull her down. But she had learned that she didn't have to let those memories define her. She had the power to choose what came next. She had the power to choose how she wanted to live, and she was no longer afraid to embrace that power. She sat back in her chair, looking out the window at the world outside. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue across the city. Linda smiled to herself, grateful for the journey she had taken, for the strength she had found, and for the lives she had touched. The world may have tried to leave her behind, but she had found her way back, and now she was helping others do the same. As Linda turned back to her laptop, she began typing the words for her next blog post. It was a reminder to herself and to those who would read it that it was never too late to take control of your life. The journey may be difficult, but it was worth it. The call to action was clear: you can reclaim your story. You have the power to choose your future. Don't let anyone take that from you. A new chapter. Linda's journey had not been an easy one, but it had been a necessary one. The woman who had once felt invisible, forgotten by the very people who were supposed to love her most, was now standing in the light of her own strength. Her decision to cut ties with Mark and Tanya, to rewrite her will, had been the catalyst for the most profound transformation of her life. What had begun as a painful experience had slowly turned into something empowering, something that would define the next chapter of her life. Now, as Linda sat in her small, sun-drenched apartment, the warm light casting a gentle glow on the pages of her journal, she reflected on how far she had come. She had taken control of her life in ways she never imagined possible. The decision to remove Mark and Tanya from her will was a turning point, but it was more than that. It was a statement, a declaration that she was no longer going to be defined by the hurt and betrayal of others. She had the power to shape her own story. In the months following her decision, Linda had come to realize that while family may be a source of love and support for some, for others, family could be a source of pain and disappointment. She had spent years giving to Mark and Tanya, only to be discarded when they no longer needed her. And yet, through that heartbreak, Linda had discovered something valuable: the power to choose. She could choose how she lived, who she spent her time with, and what kind of future she wanted for herself. And most importantly, she had learned that family was not just about blood. It was about the people who truly cared for you, who saw you for who you were and valued you for it. Linda had started to rebuild her life in small ways. She had reconnected with old friends, people she had neglected over the years while focusing on her family. She had also begun to explore hobbies and interests she had put aside long ago. She took up painting again, a passion she had abandoned years before. Her brush strokes were shaky at first, but as she spent more time with her canvas, her confidence grew. She also found herself reading more, rediscovering books that had always sparked her imagination. But it wasn't just about filling her time with new activities. It was about finding her own identity, independent of the roles she had played for so long. She had been Jake's wife, Mark's mother, Tanya's mother-in-law. But who was Linda, really? What did she want out of life? For the first time in years, she could answer those questions with clarity. She was not just a caretaker, not just a support system for others. She was Linda, a woman with her own desires, her own dreams, and her own future to carve out. Her blog, which had started as a small project to share her story, had turned into something bigger. She began writing more regularly, sharing her experiences and the lessons she had learned from the pain of being abandoned by her own family. As Linda wrote, she felt a sense of purpose that she had not felt in a long time. She was using her story to connect with others who had been through similar struggles, offering them a sense of hope and encouragement. Her words resonated with people from all walks of life, and she began receiving messages from readers who thanked her for sharing her journey. Linda's blog quickly gained a following, with people from across the country reaching out to her to share their own stories. She realized that her pain, her heartbreak, was not unique. There were countless others out there who had been abandoned, neglected, or mistreated by their families, and just like her, they were struggling to find a way to rebuild their lives. Linda's blog became a platform for people to share their stories, to find solace in knowing they were not alone. In the process, Linda also became involved in her community. She began volunteering at a local senior center where she worked with other older adults who were navigating the complexities of aging. Many of the people she met there had experienced similar betrayals from their families, and Linda found that by sharing her story with them, she could help them heal. She became a mentor, offering guidance and support to others who were facing the same challenges she had. Through this work, Linda discovered that helping others was just as healing for her as it was for them. One day, as Linda sat in the common room of the senior center talking to a woman named Ruth, she realized how much she had changed. Ruth had lost touch with her children after a bitter divorce, and for years she had felt like an outcast in her own family. But through Linda's encouragement, Ruth had begun to rebuild her confidence and reconnect with her estranged children. As Linda listened to Ruth share her progress, she couldn't help but smile. She had become a source of strength for others, just as she had once needed a source of strength herself. But the most profound realization Linda had came one evening as she sat in her apartment, reading through the comments on her latest blog post. A reader named Susan had written to Linda, sharing how much her words had helped her find the courage to leave an abusive marriage. Susan had been stuck in an unhealthy relationship for years, believing that she had no other options. But after reading Linda's story, Susan had taken the first steps toward reclaiming her life. Linda felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she realized the impact her words had had on Susan and so many others. It was then that Linda truly understood the power of sharing her story. She had been through the worst kind of betrayal, the kind that stripped her of her dignity, her confidence, and her sense of self. But by sharing her pain, by turning her heartbreak into a tool for healing, she had not only helped herself but had helped countless others along the way. And in that moment, Linda realized that her journey wasn't just about surviving the pain, it was about using that pain to fuel something greater. The next morning, as Linda sat down at her desk to write her next post, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She had finally found her purpose, her voice, and the strength to live the life she had always deserved. She had learned that the most important relationship she would ever have was the one she had with herself. And in that realization, Linda had found the power to embrace the future, whatever it may hold. Her new chapter had begun, and she was no longer afraid to live it. The airport realization. The light in Linda's small apartment had softened as the evening approached, filling the room with a calming, golden hue. She sat at her dining table, the soft clink of her teacup breaking the silence. Her life had changed in ways she hadn't imagined just a few months ago. She had stood at the airport, abandoned by the people she had trusted the most, and now here she was, a woman who had found the strength to reclaim her dignity, her sense of self, and her future. She picked up the journal she had kept throughout this journey, a quiet companion during the dark moments when everything seemed uncertain. The pages were filled with reflections, thoughts, and pieces of advice she had written to herself, words of encouragement, strength, and resilience. It wasn't just a record of what had happened to her, it was a testament to the woman she had become through all of it. Linda had come to realize something important during these months of self-discovery. The journey of healing wasn't linear. It wasn't about one decision or a single moment of realization. It was about constantly learning how to navigate life with dignity, even when faced with overwhelming pain. It was about trusting herself and her intuition, especially when the world around her seemed to want to push her down. When she had arrived at the airport, everything had felt so surreal. The disbelief and confusion of being abandoned by Mark and Tanya had been overwhelming. She had stood there for what felt like an eternity, not knowing what to do next. Her heart had been broken, and yet, in the same breath, Linda had felt something else, something quietly stirring within her, a spark of defiance. That moment, standing alone at the terminal, was the catalyst for everything that came after. It had taken time for Linda to truly understand the magnitude of the situation. She had spent years giving everything she had, her love, her time, her energy, to Mark and Tanya, believing that this was what family was supposed to be. She had sacrificed parts of herself for their happiness, never once questioning whether she was receiving the same in return. But when the time came for her to be cared for, to be shown love and respect, they had left her stranded without hesitation. The pain had been deep, but it had also been an awakening. Linda realized that she had spent too many years in the background of her own life, living for others instead of herself. She had let her identity be defined by the roles she played for other people, mother, wife, daughter-in-law, but never once had she asked herself what she wanted or needed. That day at the airport, Linda had confronted a harsh truth. She had been living for others, but now it was time to live for herself. And so she did. The days following her abandonment were filled with reflection. She didn't let herself wallow in self-pity. She allowed herself to feel the pain, but she refused to let it consume her. Instead, Linda made a promise to herself. She would no longer allow herself to be invisible. She would take control of her life, and she would rebuild her future, no matter what. Linda's first step in reclaiming her life was removing Mark and Tanya from her will. It wasn't about money. It was about protecting herself, about asserting that she mattered and that her worth wasn't tied to what others could take from her. It wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of self-respect. When she contacted Blake, Jake's old lawyer, and made the decision to rewrite her will, Linda felt a sense of power that she hadn't felt in years. The legal paperwork was just the beginning. What followed was a slow but steady process of rebuilding. It wasn't just about the financial aspect, it was about taking ownership of her life. She was no longer someone who could be taken advantage of, discarded, or ignored. Linda was reclaiming her future, and she was doing it on her terms. The decision to write about her experiences was another pivotal moment. Linda started a blog sharing her story with the world. She didn't do it for sympathy or praise, she did it because she knew her story could help others. There were people out there who had experienced similar pain, people who had been abandoned or betrayed by their families. And Linda wanted them to know that they were not alone. Her words resonated with people across the country. Readers reached out to her, sharing their own stories of betrayal and healing. It was humbling and eye-opening to realize how many people were walking the same path she had walked, feeling lost, broken, and alone. But through her blog, Linda gave them a voice. She gave them hope that they, too, could take control of their lives and create a future that wasn't defined by the actions of others. Linda's blog became a source of strength for people from all walks of life, older adults who had been cast aside by their children, people who had spent years caring for others without ever receiving care in return. It wasn't just about writing a blog, it was about creating a community of people who supported each other, who understood each other's pain, and who were committed to moving forward. The more Linda wrote, the more she realized that her purpose wasn't just about healing herself, it was about helping others heal too. She began working with local organizations that supported older adults, helping them navigate difficult family dynamics and rediscover their sense of self-worth. Her workshops were filled with people who had been through similar struggles, and Linda became a source of inspiration for many of them. They didn't just hear her story, they saw themselves in it. And with Linda's guidance, they found the courage to stand up for themselves, to reclaim their lives, and to stop letting others define their worth. Through all of this, Linda learned something crucial. Healing is a process, but it is also a choice. It wasn't something that just happened, it was something she actively chose every day. She had the power to decide what her life would look like, and she chose a life of dignity, self-respect, and independence. As she sat back in her armchair that evening, her tea now cold in her cup, Linda reflected on how far she had come. She had been abandoned by her family, betrayed by the people she loved, but she had found a way to rise above it all. She had found strength in her solitude, and in that solitude she had found herself. Linda was no longer the woman left behind at the airport. She was someone who had taken control of her own story and was now helping others write theirs. And for the first time in a long while, Linda felt at peace. She had everything she needed to build the life she deserved. Finding strength in solitude. As the weeks turned into months, Linda found herself increasingly comfortable with her new life. The sting of betrayal by her son and daughter-in-law had dulled, replaced by a quiet sense of strength. She had stood at the crossroads of her life and made a decision that had changed everything. No longer would she allow herself to be defined by the actions of others, by the people who had abandoned her when she was most vulnerable. Linda was no longer waiting for permission to live. She was taking control, carving out a future that was entirely her own. Every morning, as the sunlight filtered through the curtains of her small apartment, Linda would take a deep breath, her eyes lingering on the quiet beauty of the day unfolding outside. She no longer felt the weight of guilt or shame that had once weighed heavily on her chest. She had spent so many years trying to please others, trying to fit into roles that didn't suit her, but now she had the freedom to define herself. She was no longer just the mother, the wife, the daughter-in-law. She was Linda, the woman who had survived the most painful chapter of her life and was now determined to live the rest of it with purpose. The process of rebuilding had been slow, but every step forward felt like a triumph. Linda had started to engage with life in new ways. She had rekindled old hobbies, taken up new activities, and reconnected with old friends. Painting had become a therapeutic escape for her. The gentle swish of the brush on the canvas was her meditation, a way to quiet her mind and express emotions she had once bottled up. As she painted, she found herself lost in the rhythm of it, finding joy in every brushstroke and every color that came to life under her hands. But it wasn't just the art that brought Linda peace. She had also begun to nurture friendships, again relationships that had fallen to the wayside while she focused on her family. She reconnected with old colleagues, some of whom had known her before her marriage, before she had become entrenched in the roles of wife and mother. These friendships reminded her of the woman she used to be, the woman who had dreams, passions, and desires beyond caring for others. And through these connections, Linda had rediscovered a part of herself she had forgotten. The part of her that had once been full of life, curiosity, and ambition. It wasn't easy at first. After years of neglecting herself, Linda had to relearn how to be kind to herself. For so long, she had believed that her worth was tied to what she could give to others, to how well she fulfilled her role as a mother, a wife, and a daughter-in-law. It took time for Linda to realize that her worth wasn't contingent on anyone else's needs or expectations. Her worth came from within. She was worthy of love, respect, and kindness, especially from herself. One of the most rewarding aspects of Linda's new life was her growing involvement in her community. After starting her blog, she had begun reaching out to local organizations that focused on supporting older adults. She wanted to give back, to share her story, and to help others who had been in similar situations. Through these organizations, Linda started leading workshops on self-empowerment, helping others navigate the complexities of aging and family dynamics. At first, her workshops were small, just a few people attending at a time, but soon word spread and more people showed up, eager to hear her story and learn from her experiences. Linda wasn't a therapist or a counselor. She was a woman who had lived through the pain of abandonment and had emerged stronger because of it. Her authenticity resonated with people who had been through similar struggles. They saw in her a reflection of their own journeys, and together they began to build a community of support, healing, and growth. Linda's story became a source of hope for others. She had taken the most painful experience of her life and turned it into something beautiful, a way to help others reclaim their sense of self and find their own paths to healing. As she listened to the stories of those who attended her workshops, she realized just how universal the experience of abandonment and neglect was. There were so many people who had spent their lives giving everything to others, only to be cast aside when they were no longer needed. But Linda knew that it didn't have to be that way. No one was ever truly abandoned unless they allowed themselves to be. The power to heal and move forward was always within them, just as it had been within her. It was during one of these workshops that Linda had a moment of profound clarity. A woman named Helen, who had attended many of Linda's sessions, stood up and shared her story. She had been caring for her husband for years, watching him decline slowly as he battled illness. Once he passed away, she found herself alone, with no family to turn to and no one to help her through the grief. Helen had never been able to find her footing again, feeling completely lost. But as she spoke, she shared how Linda's words had given her the courage to start rebuilding her life. She had begun volunteering at the local library, taking up photography again, and reconnecting with friends she had lost touch with. Helen's words struck Linda deeply. She realized that by sharing her story, she had made a real difference. It wasn't just about her own healing anymore, it was about creating a ripple effect, helping others heal as well. And in that moment, Linda felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that she had found her calling. She was not just healing herself, she was helping others find their strength too. Linda's work in the community grew over time. She began collaborating with other organizations, speaking at local events, and writing articles for senior magazines. Her story was no longer just her own, it had become a beacon of hope for others who had been abandoned, ignored, or cast aside. She was building a movement, one where people no longer had to live in the shadows of their pain but could stand in the light of their resilience. One evening, as Linda sat in her living room reflecting on how far she had come, she thought about how different her life was now. She had been abandoned by her own son and daughter-in-law, but she had rebuilt herself. She had found new meaning, new connections, and new purpose. She was no longer the woman who had been left behind at the airport. She was a woman who had taken control of her life and was helping others do the same. In her heart, Linda knew that her journey was far from over. She had healed, but there was still more to do. She still had more people to reach, more lives to touch, and more work to do to continue breaking down the walls of isolation and abandonment that so many older adults faced. But for the first time in a long time, Linda felt at peace. She had taken the darkness of her past and turned it into a light that would guide her and others into a future full of possibilities. Reclaiming her legacy. Linda stood in front of her small apartment window, looking out at the world she had come to embrace. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the city, and for the first time in a long time, Linda felt a sense of peace. The quiet hum of life around her no longer seemed to overwhelm her. It was almost as if the world was moving in harmony with her own heart. Her journey from abandonment to rediscovery had taken many unexpected turns, but with each step, Linda had found more clarity. She had spent years as a passive player in her own life, trying to be everything to everyone: daughter-in-law, wife, mother, but never once thinking about what she needed. The betrayal she had suffered had shaken her to her core, but it had also been a catalyst for something far greater than she could have imagined. Linda thought back to the early days after Jake's death. Those first months had been consumed by grief and loneliness. She had been adrift, unsure of who she was without the man who had been her constant companion for over 40 years. Her life had been defined by their shared memories, their routines, their love. But when he was gone, Linda was left with only the hollow space he had occupied, and at that moment she had lost sight of herself. She had poured everything into their marriage, into her role as a mother to Mark, and into being a daughter-in-law to Tanya. In doing so, she had forgotten to nurture herself. The betrayal at the airport had been the breaking point. It wasn't just the abandonment that hurt, it was the realization that she had been taken for granted, that the people she loved most had no problem discarding her when she was no longer convenient. But that harsh truth had ignited something inside of her. Linda realized that she had spent too many years allowing others to define her worth. She was not just a caregiver, not just a wife or mother, she was Linda. She was a woman in her own right, deserving of respect, dignity, and love. And so she had made a decision that would change the course of her life. She would no longer be the victim of her circumstances. She had cut ties with Mark and Tanya, removed them from her will, and started to rebuild her life piece by piece. It wasn't about money or revenge, it was about taking control. It was about rediscovering who she was and finding the strength to move forward on her own terms. The process of healing hadn't been easy. There were days when the weight of everything would threaten to pull her back into the darkness. But Linda had learned something invaluable: healing isn't linear. Some days were better than others, but as time went on, the good days began to outnumber the bad. She had rediscovered her passions, reconnected with old friends, and even started a blog to share her story with others. Through her writing, Linda had found her voice, and in doing so, she had helped others who were suffering from similar experiences of abandonment and neglect. Her words became a lifeline for people who felt invisible, who thought they were alone in their pain. Linda's community involvement had also grown. She began volunteering at senior centers, offering workshops on self-empowerment and resilience. She used her story as a framework for helping others find their own strength. At first, it was just a small group, but as word spread, her workshops grew, and soon Linda was leading larger seminars for older adults who had been pushed aside by their families. It wasn't just about survival. It was about thriving. Linda was determined to show them that they had the power to take control of their lives just as she had. Through these experiences, Linda learned that her true legacy wasn't in the inheritance she would leave behind. It wasn't in the material things or the possessions that once seemed so important. It was in the relationships she built, in the way she touched the lives of others. Her legacy was in the strength she had shown, the lessons she had learned, and the people she had helped along the way. Her decision to cut ties with Mark and Tanya had been the beginning of her reclaiming her own legacy. It had been an act of self-preservation, yes, but it had also been an act of love for herself. She had shown herself that she was worthy of respect, that she could stand up for herself, and that she could create the life she wanted. As Linda continued to work with her community, she realized that her journey had come full circle. The woman who had been left behind at the airport had become a woman who had found her voice and used it to empower others. Linda had turned her pain into purpose, and in doing so, she had found a deep sense of fulfillment. She wasn't just living for herself, she was living for others too. Her work was her way of giving back, of ensuring that those who had been abandoned or overlooked would have someone who saw them, who valued them, and who would help them rise above their circumstances. One evening, as Linda sat in the community room of the senior center, looking around at the faces of those who had gathered to hear her speak, she felt a profound sense of peace. These people who had once felt invisible now had a voice. They were no longer the forgotten ones. They were standing tall, embracing their worth and taking control of their lives just as Linda had done. She realized that her journey had come full circle. What had begun as a painful betrayal had led to a beautiful, empowering transformation. Linda had found her purpose, and in doing so, she had found her own peace. She no longer carried the weight of the past. Instead, she was moving forward, building a future that was all her own. As Linda looked out at the group of individuals who had gathered, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had taken the lessons from her painful past and used them to create something beautiful. She had reclaimed her legacy, and in doing so, she had given others the tools to reclaim theirs. For the first time in a long time, Linda knew that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, she could truly say that she was living, not just existing, but living fully, authentically, and with a heart open to whatever the future held. A new beginning. The months that followed Linda's decision to sever ties with Mark and Tanya were filled with change. The transformation that had begun with her decision at the airport had rippled outward, touching every part of her life. What had once been a life consumed by grief, betrayal, and a sense of worthlessness was now a life defined by empowerment, self-discovery, and resilience. It wasn't just that Linda had moved past the pain. She had used it as the foundation for building something greater than she ever imagined. One evening, as she sat in her cozy living room with a cup of tea, Linda thought back to the moment she had sat in the airport terminal, the weight of abandonment pressing down on her chest. She remembered how, in that instant, she had felt invisible, as though the very people who should have cared for her had discarded her as easily as a used ticket. She had never imagined that a single moment of pain could spark such a profound transformation in her life. But now, looking back, she understood. That moment, painful as it was, had opened the door to something new. Linda had embraced the pain, and rather than allowing it to define her, she had chosen to define herself. She had no longer allowed herself to be defined by the roles others assigned to her. She was no longer just a mother, a wife, or a daughter-in-law. She was Linda, a woman who had found her strength, her voice, and her purpose. Her blog had become her voice, one that resonated with others who had been through similar pain and betrayal. Her words had offered solace, comfort, and hope to those who had felt invisible and unheard. But it wasn't just about sharing her story, it was about creating a space where others could share theirs. Linda had built a community of people who supported one another, who understood that their worth was not defined by their past experiences or the people who had abandoned them. One of the most meaningful aspects of Linda's journey was the work she had done with senior centers and local organizations. Her workshops, initially small and intimate, had grown into larger gatherings where older adults could come together and learn how to reclaim their sense of self. Linda's focus had always been on empowerment, teaching others how to take control of their lives just as she had done. She had learned that healing wasn't just about moving on from the past, it was about accepting what had happened, learning from it, and finding the strength to move forward. But it wasn't just her professional life that had flourished. Linda's personal life had also transformed in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had reconnected with old friends and even made new ones. She had learned to fill her days with activities that brought her joy: painting, reading, gardening, and even traveling. The once empty spaces in her life, which had been filled with sorrow and regret, were now filled with laughter, fulfillment, and a sense of adventure. She had realized that life, no matter how old you were, was still full of possibilities. The more she embraced the new opportunities that life presented, the more Linda realized that she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. She was taking chances, pushing herself to explore the world around her and finding joy in the little things. A walk in the park, a conversation with a new friend, the feeling of a paintbrush on a blank canvas, these were the moments that had once been overlooked, but now they were the very moments that brought her peace. Her relationship with her son, Mark, remained strained, but Linda had accepted that some things were beyond her control. She couldn't force him to love her, and she couldn't change the way he saw her. But she had learned to stop depending on him for validation. She had learned to stop waiting for his approval. Instead, she had focused on what she could control: her own happiness, her own peace, and her own future. One of the most profound lessons Linda had learned was that family wasn't just about blood. It was about who showed up for you, who truly cared about your well-being, and who made the effort to nurture and support you. Through her work with the Senior Center and her growing network of friends and community members, Linda had built a new family, one that was rooted in love, respect, and shared experiences. These were the people who showed up for her, who valued her for who she was, not for what she could provide. Linda realized that she had never truly been alone. Yes, she had lost Mark and Tanya, but in their absence, she had gained something far more valuable. Independence. She had become her own source of strength. She no longer needed the validation or approval of her biological family. She had found her own sense of worth, her own sense of belonging. As the days went on, Linda continued to grow in ways she hadn't anticipated. She felt more confident, more at ease in her own skin. She had learned to love herself not in a narcissistic or self-centered way, but in a way that was rooted in self-respect. She had learned that self-love was the foundation of everything else. Without it, she would never have been able to stand up for herself, to speak her truth, or to create the life she had always wanted. Linda also began to see that, in many ways, her life had come full circle. The woman who had once felt small, invisible, and discarded now stood tall, strong, and proud of the woman she had become. She had found her voice, and with that voice she had not only changed her own life but had touched the lives of so many others. It was in the quiet moments, sitting in her apartment or walking through the park, that Linda would pause and reflect on how far she had come. She no longer felt the weight of the past hanging over her. She no longer felt the burden of regret or sorrow. She had embraced her story, her pain, and her growth. And in doing so, she had become the person she had always been meant to be. One day, as she stood in front of the mirror, looking at the woman who had once felt so lost, Linda smiled. She was no longer the person she had been at the airport, nor was she the person she had been in the early days after Jake's death. She was a woman who had learned to love herself, to trust herself, and to create a future full of purpose and joy. Linda knew that her journey wasn't over. Life would continue to present challenges, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced her fears, faced the pain, and come out the other side stronger. And with that strength, she was ready for whatever the future held. Her story was her own to write, and she was determined to keep writing it, one step, one choice, one day at a time. One of the most powerful lessons from Linda's journey is the importance of reclaiming your own life, regardless of past pain or betrayal. It's never too late to redefine who you are and what you deserve. Linda's story teaches us that no matter how much we've given to others, whether it's our time, energy, or love, our worth is not tied to the approval or needs of others. True healing begins when we stop waiting for others to validate us and start embracing our own strength and autonomy. In life, especially as we age, it's easy to feel invisible or forgotten. But Linda's journey shows that our value isn't determined by the roles others assign to us. We have the power to rewrite our stories, to find new passions, and to build connections with people who truly see and value us. Even in the face of abandonment, we can choose to rebuild, to embrace independence, and to nurture our own growth. It's never too late to reclaim your peace, your happiness, and your purpose. Let this lesson be a reminder to honor yourself and create the life you deserve, no matter the stage of life you're in. I hope this story has touched you, and I invite you to share your thoughts below. Wherever you are watching from, I would love to hear from you. And if you found strength in this story, stay with us, because next time we'll explore another powerful journey of courage and renewal. See you then.